about the whole conversation that I had with someone who had a large company, right? So Charles, I recently had a conversation with an individual, a lead that, came to us. He was interested about the E2 visa, and I started actually talking to him about the L1 visa because, in his email, or his email address, was his company name. So I searched him
Uh-huh.
up, what his company was, and I saw his company roster, and I saw that he had a lot of employees, right? So I asked him, are you looking to expand your existing business into the United States? Is that your intention? Obviously, or not obviously, but he ended up saying, yeah, it is, right? And so we got talking about the L1 visa, right? And about the requirements, and that you sort of have to mimic what you have going on in your foreign country, and sort of expand that business into the US, right? So we previously spoken about, like, you need a minimum of 8 employees in that foreign country with a clear hierarchical structure, and you
Sure.
need to replicate that in the United States. And he posed a really, really good question. And the question was, he has, let's say, 15 plus employees, let's say 15, right?
Uh-huh.
And he says, if I bring over 5 employees from Canada who have been working for me for the past 12 months, right, as part of the requirements to bring someone over on the L-1B visa, can they be part of that 8 employee minimum in the United States? Sort of this, like, reflection of what we got to do. So what's the answer to that? Like, what's the guidance?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So for people who don't know, right, if you get the L1 to start with, an L1A, you don't necessarily have to have any employees in the US, but by the end of that first year of your L1 visa, you've got to have at least 8 employees hired at the US company. So I guess what this guy was asking you, well, can I grab 5 or 6 or how many from my Canadian company, bring them over to the US here and use them to fulfill that requirement? That's a good question. The theoretical answer, I guess, is yes. There's nothing that prohibits you from bringing over, multiple people from your primary business overseas, bringing them over here to the US, and then using that head count, those people here in the US, to meet that requirement. At the end of the first year, you've got to have 8 or more. So that's the theoretical answer. Yes, you could do that. There's nothing preventing you from doing it. In our nearly 20 years of practice, we've never had a scenario like that. So I can't speak directly from experience to say, yeah, sure, we've done this multiple times. It's
Yeah.
not a problem. And I would also say, I suspect that USCIS, on an informal level, this isn't a written rule or anything, but they would maybe not look very favorably on that as well. Because I mean, here's the practical question too. First of all, could you even get that many employees over here that quickly? It would be tough, right? So if we're talking about a 1 year time frame from the time you first got that L1 till you're going to do the renewal, could you get 4 or 5 petitions filed, reviewed, completed, get them over here? That would be tough just on a practical level,
Yeah.
I would say. But, even if you could get past that hurdle, I think they would have possible, objections to that. Now, again, it also depends whether these are L1As or L1Bs. I think in this scenario, L1Bs, as long as they are really specialized knowledge workers, they really have this kind of specialized, you know, experience that you can't find here in the there you certainly have a better case. If you wanted to bring 4 or 5 people over and they all wanted to be L1A managers or executives, there you would definitely run into more resistance because they would be like because here's the thing, I mean,
Okay.
an anyone coming in on L1A is supposed to manage other people. So if you're bringing over 3 or 4 managers and you only have besides just 3 or 4 managers and only another 3 or 4 people, residents here that you're hiring, they would say, "Well, these people aren't managing anybody." I mean,
Right.
a manager has to have at least 2 subordinates, I would say, at a minimum to really be a manager.
Okay.
So that's kind of where we'd go with that. But again, if it was L1Bs and you could make a good argument, I think, theoretically you could make a good case on that.
Okay.
Here's the other thing too, though, to add to that, Alex, is if that's really the goal of the client and, they have a need, they have a real need to get that many people over here. This isn't just to kinda, check the box and get all the bodies here to get the L1 approved, but they really need a business to have a business need to get that many people over here. I would say you'd have to kinda combine different tools that you have, especially in the case of Canadians, because you have one extra you've got the TN visa with Canadians that most other nationalities don't. What I would do is if for this client or anybody else in a similar situation, I'd say, look, let's not just bring them all over as L1s. Let's look at H1Bs. Let's look at treaty national, TNs, again, which is only available to Canadians and Mexicans. But I would say let's mix it up. And because you could, by mixing it up, you're not going to get as much resistance from USCIS, and then also by mixing it up, you can, some things could maybe even move faster, than the L1. Like you could theoretically probably move a little bit faster with E2s. You could bring over some of those employees as E2s theoretically too, assuming
Oh,
they're Canadian.
okay. Yeah, assuming
Assuming
they're
they're
Canadian.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, another perspective, like on a business side, I mean, we on their business view, right? The cost of us doing all the paperwork for, let's say, for 5 L-1Bs, sometimes it would be a little bit too costly. Might as well just hire within the United States for depending what the job is, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's another thing to take in perspective, like how plausible is that scenario or how realistic that scenario is, right? And who's incurring those legal costs, right?
Right.
So that's another thing to think about. But that's great. For a Canadian company, they can utilize TN visas, they can utilize E2
Me too.
visas to bring down a workforce. They don't necessarily have to do the L-1Bs. Obviously, the L-1Bs, if the company is expanding, depending what the company is, right? If it's
Right.
expanding rapidly and you need this talent and you need their, let's say, support in order to expand the company, depending how their role proceeds, after the first year, do they become higher level managers and whatnot? And is their intention to stay in the States and can we get them an EB1C afterwards? Can we get them a green card? Obviously, at that point, some people see it as a huge benefit, right?
Well,
To do that. Now, I mean, the question is another question, it was sort of answering the question, but veering off a little bit with regards to if someone comes down under an E2 as an employee for the L1A company
mhm.
owner, can they eventually get an EB1C
If
if the
someone
employee?
come if the employee comes down as an E2, you're
Yeah,
asking?
yeah,
Can they get
yeah,
the EB1C?
yeah.
So I spoke maybe a little bit too quickly here, but I'll answer your question and then we'll discuss another
Okay.
scenario with E2. So if the person comes down in an E2, could they qualify for an EB1C? Short answer, yes. You can do it, but the only thing is you got to be careful about the timing because if they come on the L1, then as you know, with the L1, we have to show that they worked for the foreign company in one of the previous 3 years. And the clock stops when they come to the US on the L1. So let's take a scenario. Somebody comes on an L1A and 4 years later, they say, hey, I want to file for the EB1C. That's not a problem because in the L1, the clock stopped when they entered the US on the L1. And even though 4 years had passed, they look back to the previous 3 years from the moment they entered on the L1. But if they come on the E2, you don't get that protection. Why that is, I don't know. It's just how it is in the law. So
Okay.
when you come on the E2, the clock keeps continuing. So you can't wait more than 2 years after you have an E2 to file for the EB1C, right? Because you have to
Mhm.
look back 3 years. Where did you work? Did you work for at least 1 year in the previous 3 years overseas for this company? So that's why you can go
Okay.
as late as 2 years in that E2 status, but not any longer because then if you look back 3 years, you're not going to get that
Gotcha.
employment. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But here's the thing. I myself forgot this. When I proposed, when I said, "Okay, what options do people have?" They could bring them an L1B, they could do the TN, they can even theoretically do the E2. Here's the problem with that, the potential problem. If the if the owner of the US company is an individual, it's not a company, it's not, let's say, it's not a Canadian company. The owner of the US company is an individual and that individual is in the US, but not in an E2 status, then he or she cannot invite over E2 employees for that. So if, this is a scenario, but if we could imagine a scenario where if the owner were overseas, so let's say the owner has a Canadian company, then they open up a US company. The owner does not come to the US. They remain back in Canada. Sure, you can set up E2's employees. You can do L1s for your employees, L1Bs, L1As, whatever. That's fine. But if the owner comes to the US, but that owner does not have E2 status, then you can't do the E2s for the employees.
But
So that's
highly
the
unlikely, right? How often have you seen those scenarios where an owner that's investing in a US company doesn't move and live in the United States, right?
I
Like,
mean, it's
this is
unusual, but it happens. I mean,
it's unu
we've
it
had it
happens?
happen.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And again, this is not an issue if you have a direct subsidiary relationship. So if you have
Right,
a Canadian company and that Canadian company opens the US company,
right.
then you're okay. It doesn't matter who comes here on an L1, E2, whatever. It doesn't
Right,
matter.
right. So it's only the scenario is only if the individual opens up this
US
company
company. Yep.
under, yeah, US company under an L1A. then they cannot bring E2 workers.
Yep.
Okay,
Correct.
that's
Yeah, yeah.
cool.
Okay,
Well, I
this
think
is started,
yeah. Yeah, it's very technical, but,
yeah, something
listen,
ChatGPT will never tell you. Hey, this is,
I
I don't know if this is in our guide, but yeah, this is a spot to plug our guide. I mean, for these issues and other ones, check below, click here on this link, or else in the description of the video, we've got our link to our L1 guide, and that covers a lot of stuff. It's on our YouTube channel. It's a 3-part series, and hopefully, we can, answer a lot of questions that people have about an L1.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're interested in booking a consultation with Charles or myself, the links are also below in the description. So we would love to chat, learn more about your company, and see if the L1 is for you or any other visas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks again.